And now it's time for a talk on India and the networked world. May I invite Sushila Ravindranath to introduce best-selling author and MP for Thiruvananthapuram, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
There are some people who really don't need any introduction, and Dr. Shashi Tharoor is one of them. But anyway, he is the former Under Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs. He is also Chairman of Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. But he's also been the best-selling author of 15 books, fiction and non-fiction. And his first book, The Great Indian Novel, written in 1989, was an instant bestseller. It was satirical and was great fun. And he's written 4 books on fiction, and the rest are all non-fiction. I've always wondered why he didn't continue writing fiction. He writes on India in transformation. So, India Shastra is his 15th book, published last year. He has won numerous literary awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. He is a true polyglot. He is also the pioneer in using social media to connect with people. He knows both the good sides and the flip side of it. He was India's most followed politician on Twitter till our Prime Minister took over. He's a great orator. His recent speech in Oxford went viral for many months. I don't know how many speeches go viral. Dr. Tharoor has strong views about the net and its advantages. He has said that poverty line is not the only line the leaders have to think about, but also the fiber optic line that connects us. Those not connected would not have access to the brave new world. May I invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor to talk about the networked world?
Thank you, Sushila Ravindranath, for that gracious introduction. And thanks for the warm applause. I thought the first time around you were applauding for the Prime Minister having overtaken me. But I'm glad that, I'm delighted to be here. In fact, the Hindu Literary Festival has been a fascinating experience. I've also had the delight of watching my son making his debut as a fiction author here. And it's been 2 great days, I'm sure, for all of you in this wonderful auditorium. In 2012, when I wrote my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, many sort of thought that I was talking about some Pax Indica like Pax Britannica or Pax Americana, some sort of global domination. And I had absolutely nothing like that in mind. What I was talking about was that India has a critical role to play in what has become a cooperative networked system in our multipolar world. So the idea of Pax Indica was not of some sort of world leadership or even as a next superpower, as some people have rashly called it. They've stopped calling it that now in recent years, but I remember one of my many so-called controversies in the media was when I said, how can we be the next superpower when we are still super poor? Which of course remains sadly still true. But Pax Indica, in my view, was about India's role in shaping the emerging global network, which is what defines international relations and world politics in the 21st century. So, since this was supposed to be a standalone lecture, I thought I'd better give you all some points to take away, and I was wondering how best to tackle this when I was reminded that in the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson had announced 14 points to end the war, and the French President Clemenceau had said 14 points? Even the good Lord only needed 10. So I thought, having no aspirations to either emulating Wilson or the good Lord, I would stop short of 10. So let me give you 9 points to frame my lecture, and then I'll take your questions or comments as we go along. So the first point is that there's no escaping globalization. When I left for the US to go to graduate school back in 1975, the word globalization was not used. It didn't exist pretty much. Yet I realized my own life has been something of an epitome of it. A Malayali boy born in London, raised in Mumbai, high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi, graduate school in the United States, worked in Europe, worked in Southeast Asia, and finally ended up back here amongst all of you. There's probably a better example that went around the internet a few years ago during the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. You don't have to stop me if you've already heard this before, but it's the story of how this is a classic example of globalization. You might well say, what's poor Princess Diana got to do with globalization? Well, think of the tragedy this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with her Egyptian companion, who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are then chased. They're chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorbikes and scooters into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the entire story is being told to you here in Chennai by an Indian member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram. There's globalization. So the fact is that globalization is ubiquitous. It infects the most commonplace assumptions of our life, even, I would argue, here. But remember that here in India, self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency were our mantra for more than 4 decades after independence. And there were real doubts as to whether the country should open itself up to the world economy, which we now take for granted in globalization. Whereas in the Western world, most people axiomatically associate capitalism with freedom, India's nationalists axiomatically associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. So our nationalist movement was indeed instinctively suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, seeing him as the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. The unarticulated assumption was, they say they're coming here to trade or to invest, but what they really want to do is to rule you. Which only goes to show that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. So we went in a very different direction from, well, actually in the direction that most developing countries went into, but different from a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore. That is, instead of integrating India into the global capitalist system, we withdrew from it. The British had already reduced us to just 2% of global trade by 1947, but by 1980, we were down to 0.2% of global trade, having essentially cut ourselves off from the global economy by throwing up the protectionist barriers, making self-reliance the slogan, and spending 45 years after independence with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the economy, essentially, therefore, subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty. And the reason we did all that was because we felt, our leaders felt, that the political independence they had fought so long and so hard for could only be guaranteed or ensured by economic independence. Now that lesson took a long time to unlearn, but it's important for us to appreciate the extent of the paradigm shift that was needed for India to give up these cherished assumptions of our independence movement and chart a new course. It took a world-class financial crisis in 1991 when our physical stocks of gold had to be shipped off to London to stand guarantee and collateral against an IMF loan. Only then did we decide to change course, and now, of course, that seems truly irreversible. It's now been 24 years since Manmohan Singh, as finance minister, stood up and made that historic speech, budget speech in Parliament, where he paraphrased Victor Hugo to say that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And that idea was the liberalization of the Indian economy. And in those 24 years since that speech, we've had governments of every conceivable political stripe in India. Every party, barring the CPM, has directly wielded power, and the CPM, of course, has supported UPA 1 in wielding power. Not one of these parties, not one of these governments has reversed the achievements of liberalization or moved to dilute the increasing global connectedness of the Indian economy. So as a result, what does it mean to be a young person in Chennai today? It can mean waking up to an alarm clock made in China, downing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans designed first in America, and taking a Japanese scooter or a Korean car to get to an Indian college, where your textbooks might be printed with German-invented technology on paper first pulped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish, but given Nokia's misfortunes, let's say nowadays more likely a Taiwanese mobile phone, to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, and aloo and hari mirch, potatoes and green chilies, that didn't exist in India until 400 years ago when they were brought here from Latin America. And of course, the most desi thing of all is suspicion of anything foreign. Now, in such a world, issues that once seemed very far away are actually very much in your backyard. What happens in East Asia or Southern Africa, from protectionist politics to deforestation, desertification, the fight against AIDS, climate change, can affect your lives where you live here in South India. And your choices anywhere, what you buy, how you vote, can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We're all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. Second, there is a paradox at the heart of this globalized new world. So when we think about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, we think, of course, of the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our living rooms and our computers and our mobile phones snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are the forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We have to think about the changes that terrorism and conflict have also wrought in the world. The aftermath of 9/11 and 26/11 in our country, the war on terror, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and of course the wars in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption, which threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, and between people of different religions, different creeds, different cultures. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together seem at the very same time, through international terrorism and conflict, to be driving us apart. This is the defining paradox of our age, and living with this paradox is at the heart of the challenges of our brave new world. Third, globalization does not flow only in one direction. Now, this is not a particularly new insight. In fact, when the Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay at the peak of the British Empire in the 1890s, he simply built a grander, more opulent hotel that was open to Indians. Pike's had a sign saying Indians and dogs not allowed. So then he built instead the Taj Mahal Hotel where Indians were allowed. I think dogs still were not, but I may be wrong there. The Taj is today considered one of the finest hotels in the world, whereas Pike's has long since closed. Now, when the same Mr. Tata set up India's first ever steel mill in the face of implacable British hostility in 1905, a senior imperial official sneered at the time that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. What a pity he didn't live long enough to see the descendants of Mr. Tata buy the remnants of British Steel when they acquired Chorus a few years ago. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. And I wonder what else he might have felt if he'd lived to the internet era and seen that little photograph going around the internet last summer, of the British Prime Minister having won re-election and going off to Buckingham Palace in an Indian-owned car, the Jaguar, escorted by another Indian-owned car, the Land Rover. Enough to give us all a slight post-colonial frisson, I think, right? But in other words, it's time to set aside the stereotypes of who can and cannot excel in our globalizing world. Just a generation ago, everything, the tallest, the biggest, the best, was by or in the United States of America. Today, that's no longer the case. The smartest executive jets in the world are made by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which overtook the previous tallest building in Taipei, which in turn had supplanted one in Malaysia. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The challenger to the Panama Canal, cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by a Chinese company. The biggest shopping mall is in Beijing. And the country with the highest per capita income is not the United States, it's Singapore. 30 years ago, 25 years ago, all these categories would have been headed by the United States. The US does remain the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in various areas where it alone had once been dominant. It's not so much the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. Growth projections for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the original BRIC countries, indicate that they will collectively match the collective G7 share of the global GDP by 2050, if not 2040. A couple of decades ago, no one would have mentioned India and high technology in the same breath. The migration to America of a number of Indian engineers from the 1960s onwards helped create a new perception of India amongst those they worked with. The engineers had a solid grounding in their field, in the IITs and the various other engineering colleges here. They excelled in the freedom afforded to them in the US. And so an Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian created Hotmail, a third started Sun Microsystems, and Indians have been involved in some 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley. Over time, the Indianness of engineers and software developers began to be taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Today, Americans speak of the IITs with the same reverence they used to accord to MIT. The image of India has changed from that of a backward developing country. In fact, when I went to graduate school in the States, it was still naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, snake charmers doing the Indian rope trick, and the most positive image was Maharajas on caparisoned elephants, right? Now we've gone from all of that to a land that produces engineers and computer experts. Now, sometimes this has unintended consequences. I've often told the story of a friend of mine who, like me, was a history major, being accosted at a European airport by an anxiously perspiring white man saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? So if the old stereotype was what I described, today the new stereotype is every one of us must be a software guru or a computer geek. Fourth, the new millennium is a time for diversity. In 1996, Professor Samuel Huntington took a look at the globalizing world emerging from the Cold War and predicted a clash of civilizations. He was wrong. Civilizations are not monoliths. Each of the civilizations he analyzed actually has a great deal more of diversity within it than he allowed for. And religion and culture are merely amongst the many variables governing the actions and policies of states. Very often, states with a religion in common may have other differences amongst them. And certainly in foreign policy, take, for example, the contrasting positions taken by Iran and Pakistan on the Taliban rule in Afghanistan. And you immediately see that there cannot be any such thing as a monolithic Islamic entity in world affairs. The leaders of tomorrow, and I hope there are many of them amongst the young people in this hall, will have to know both how to live with change in a varied world and how to live with contradictions. I mean, I've been using for 25 years in my speeches the line that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And it is. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we are still a young republic. Our IT experts stride confidently into the 21st century, while most of the rest of our population lives in each of the other 20 centuries. But what's interesting is quite often these opposites coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India, again, that went around the internet, is from the last Kumbh Mela but one. And it was an absolutely cliched photograph in every other respect but one. So in this photograph, you've got this naked sadhu, right out of Hollywood central casting for naked sadhus, you know. Matted hair, wispy beard, wart on his face, broken teeth, Rudraksha mala around his neck, looking away, staring away into the distance. And you would think, my God, what a cliched picture of timeless otherworldliness. But in this photograph, this naked sadhu is chatting away on a mobile phone. Now, this is, of course, in many ways emblematic of the Indian paradox. And when I suggested it to my publishers as a perfect cover image for my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, I was told, no, it's too much of a cliche. But the fact is that cliches are cliches because they are true. And what's important is to realize we're functioning in a world where a naked Hindu holy man comfortably uses a cell phone, and we have to embrace both the possibilities and the complications that that represents. Now, one of the paradoxes of our globalizing world is that if the 20th century has made the world safe for democracy, in that famous phrase from the First World War, then the challenge of the 21st century is to make the world safe for diversity. The world as a whole must reflect the idea that is already familiar to the handful of multi-ethnic democracies we have, like India or America, that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of food you eat, the sounds you make when you speak, the God you choose to worship or not, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everybody else and dream the same dreams. It is not essential in democratic India to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. But the world doesn't quite yet function on that principle. And these tendencies that I've been describing to you for the last 20 minutes, the author, American author Benjamin Barber, wrote an interesting book called Jihad versus McWorld, in which he posited these two options as the twin prospects facing humanity. And I quote, "Jihad in the name of 100 narrowly conceived fates against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself," unquote, versus a McWorld of globalization run rampant, a world of fast music, fast computers, fast food, fast cars, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. Now, both Jihad and McWorld, of course, end up by obliterating our most precious possession, our sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identities. We need to strive for a world in which we can preserve our individual identities and yet work in cooperation with each other. The only solution is to fight for diversity. Fifth, and I'm afraid each of these points seems to imply a but to the previous point. But the new networked world is seeing the rise of old problems. We think of religious wars and crusades as relics of medieval history, yet they have come back to haunt us in the second decade of the 21st century with the rise of ISIS or Daesh. Why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. As a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part, and to many not even the most important part. But when other avenues of identity mobilization are either restricted, as happens in autocratic states, or difficult, as happens in societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, which we see widely in the Middle East, then ordinary people tend to fall back on the one identity that seems basic to them, and that's their religion. Secular intellectuals like Amartya Sen, or for that matter myself, may give equal weight in enumerating their multiple identities. They may give equal weight, in Amartya Sen's case, to the tag of being an Oxbridge Don to the fact of being born in a Hindu family. Or I might say that at certain moments it's more important to me that I'm a cricket fan or a Stephanian, as to the fact that I'm born in a Nair family or a Hindu family generally. But people who think like that have to accept that we are a minority in today's world. And it would be unwise indeed for us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism to so many desperate young men and even so many young women around the world. We see that these problems of the network world are increasingly even being reflected in our country. And of course, there can be something precious and valuable about religion, about having a faith that allows a human being to see himself at one with others, stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from politics? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong? Where religion will not be the principal unit of identity, and identity not the basic driver of politics? If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than to faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then only might we be able to resist both jihad and McWorld. If we all come to accept and understand that every one of us has many identities, and that we can perhaps assert each of these without attacking the others who also have multiple identities, there might be a way forward. Sixth, the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. There are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between. Instead, the metaphor for today's globalized world is really that of the World Wide Web. In this increasingly networked world, we're going to have to work through multiple networks, and those networks will sometimes overlap with each other with common memberships. Sometimes they will be distinct, the members will be different, or some members in common, some not. They will all serve our interests in different ways and for different purposes. Let me illustrate what this means in practical terms. So every year, our foreign minister meets her counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she'll add the Brazilians and the South Africans, and she'll have a meeting of the BRICS. Then she'll take out the Russians and Chinese and meet in IBSA for South-South cooperation. Then she'll add the Chinese, but not the Russians, for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that's a member of all these four groupings, and not merely because our name begins with that most useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but because we actually have a useful contribution to make to each of these, and each of these forums serves our purposes in world affairs. I mean, this kind of World Wide Web style networking reflects other paradoxes of our world. So India plays a crucial role at the United Nations. We are aspiring to a permanent seat in the Security Council, and yet we also have to be focused on South Asia and on the 7 countries that are our immediate neighbors. We belong both to the non-aligned movement, which reflects our history and our colonial experience, and where we rail against the Western countries very often, but we also belong to the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries we're busy attacking in the non-aligned movement. We are a leading voice of the G77, the global trade union of developing countries at the United Nations. And we're also a leading member of the G20, the global management of the world macroeconomy. Now, we have the ability to be in all these institutional networks, pursuing different objectives with different allies and partners, and in each finding a valid role, a valid purpose that suits us. That's why when I was minister, briefly, in foreign affairs, I suggested rashly that we had moved beyond non-alignment to something I dubbed multi-alignment. But I have to confess the phrase never caught on. Now, in the 21st century world, we are likely to spend a lot of our lives, and the young people here will spend their adult lives interacting with people who don't look, sound, dress, or eat like you. that you might work for an internationally oriented company, because pretty much every company now has to be internationally oriented, with clients, colleagues, investors, consumers from around the globe. You're likely to take your holidays in far-flung destinations. Impossible in my time as a child, when a foreign holiday was a very, very rare dream for a microscopic minority. The world in which young people today will grow up into is going to be full of such opportunities. But along with such opportunities, you will also find yourself vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities to threats from beyond our borders. Terrorism, of course, but also transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like swine flu. Now, wouldn't you want your government to devise policies to deal with such challenges that would affect you and one day your children's lives? Should such policies in an ever more interdependent world even be called foreign? One of the reasons that foreign policy matters today is that foreign policy is no longer merely foreign. It affects you right here where you live. All of us should want our government to seize the opportunities that the 21st century world provides, while managing the risks and protecting you from the threats that this world has also opened you up to. So the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world, where one is tied to the other more closely than it might appear on the surface. Clearly, the effects of the China market distortion, for example, have revealed the extent to which economies of different countries are closely tied. Mr. Modi made cracks about how the value of the rupee was heading towards the age of the UPA finance minister. I'm afraid even he's going to have a challenge catching up in terms of age with the value of the rupee under his leadership. But maybe it's not his fault, it's what's been happening in China and elsewhere in the world. Or oil price decisions made thousands of kilometers away can bring down a state government in India, can bring down central governments in India. So that interdependency is very, very clear. Seventh, this involves working for change on the global scene. The dominance of a handful of small industrialized Western countries, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods organizations, principally the World Bank and the IMF, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the West to the East. With all of this, and the emergence of course, new powers, new economies, new countries, which, unlike China, were omitted from the high table set up in 1945, we have clearly reached a point where there is need for a system redesign of global governance to ensure that all countries can participate in a manner commensurate with their capacity. Let's face it, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. More and more countries, and certainly speaking for India, I would say, we've had enough of being on the menu and we want to claim a seat at the table. For too long, India has been a rule taker in the international system, but it's now ready to join the rule makers. We have the capacity, the experience, the track record, the human resources, and the technology to play a major role in helping manage the global commons on issues ranging from cyberspace to outer space. This means we must work to distribute global power, not just in the UN Security Council, which everyone talks about, but also in the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, it's absurd that to this day, the weighted vote of China is equivalent to that of Belgium. The new development bank now that the Chinese have set up under the auspices of BRICS with an Indian president and a Chinese headquarters is inevitably going to grow as an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions, to the World Bank and the IMF as far as developing countries are concerned. And as for the political organs of global governance, it is simply not reasonable to run the world's premier international organization on the basis of the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than those of 2016. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council enjoy their positions and their right to a veto because they happen to have won a war 70 years ago. Now, it's difficult to justify any institutional arrangement in the 21st century by an event of history that took place 7 decades ago. Eighth, the mass media is vital for today's leaders, but it's not enough. We all know you can't hope to succeed in the 21st century without the mass media, and that obviously includes social media, as was pointed out in introducing me, both to know what's going on and what's on the minds of people, and also to project your own views and concerns to them. Any doubt that I might have had about the reach and influence of global mass communications, I remember even before the internet era, but during the global satellite television era, that any misconception I might have had was dispelled when I was representing the UN at a conference in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I met a Tibetan Buddhist monk in the parking lot, in his robes, clashing cymbals and chanting his mantras, who paused in his chanting to point at me and say, "I've seen you on BBC." So, the fact is that new communications technology, starting 20-odd years ago, but now all the more with the internet, has shrunk the world and in a real sense has made it one neighborhood, one market, one audience. But do not forget that this global mass media reflects principally and inevitably the interests of its producers. What passes for international culture is essentially the culture of the economically developed world. Yes, there is the occasional developing country voice, a third world voice, but it speaks a first world language. In fact, again, that's embedded in the DNA of the system. As far back as the first Congo Civil War in 1962, the journalist Edward Baer wrote about seeing a television newsman back in 62 in a camp of violated Belgian nuns going around with a camera and a microphone saying, "Anybody here been raped and speak English?" In other words, it wasn't enough to have suffered. One must have suffered and be able to express one's suffering in the language acceptable to the journalist. That's the world we live in. And that leads to the obvious corollary question, well, can the internet compensate? The question is, would the internet further the information revolution? Is it a more effective tool for democratization of voices? Well, ironically, it's in the West that it's become really that, because as you know, thanks to the internet, information is now much more accessible to everyone. Internet access in the US is some 97% of the population, but here in India, it's still only hovering around 15. Perhaps some claim 20%. Now, this could dramatically change, of course, with the 4G onset, the development of more affordable smartphone technology, cheaper means of getting on the internet, that could perhaps take us up from that 15, 20% to 65, 70%, in which case the world as well as our country would be transformed. But until that happens, the stark reality of the internet today remains the digital divide. You can tell the rich from the poor by their internet connections. The gap between technological haves and have-nots exists and has been widening, both within countries and between them. The information revolution, I often say, is quite unlike the French Revolution, because it's a revolution with a lot of liberty, some fraternity, and no equality. So, as was quoted earlier, I have argued that the poverty line is no longer the only line we need to think about when we face the challenges of development. There's also the high-speed digital line, there's a fiber optic line, all the lines that connect us but which also exclude those who literally are not plugged in to the possibilities of our brave new world. The key to the internet divide is the computer keyboard. Those who do not have one still risk marginalization, and we cannot afford to forget them. If you recognize both the potential and the limitations of today's media, the 21st century could yet become a time of mutual understanding such as we've never seen before. A world in which we all know it's easier than ever before to meet strangers must also become a world in which it is easier than ever before to see strangers as no different from ourselves, and to connect them and to validate the voice of every one of them. Ninth and finally, I'm really conscious that we are all like Egyptian mummies. We're all strapped for time. And so if I'm going to have some time for questions and answers with with all of you, I'd better bring this to a close. I believe that we do need to be conscious that in describing this globalized, networked world, we must not fall into the easy elitism of looking at it only from the top down. The fact is, we all have a responsibility to be conscious of those who are not as fortunate as we are, those who don't get to attend literary festivals. I had the privilege as a young man of working for those who've lost everything, the world's refugees. When I was younger than perhaps the majority of people in this room, I found myself running the UN's program for Vietnamese boat people rescued at sea and brought into the port of Singapore. And I could tell you lots of stories about that, but I'll never forget one family which had left Vietnam in a tiny little boat with a cannibalized tractor engine. And sure enough, the engine conked out and the boat started drifting on the South China Sea. And the parents were essentially living on rainwater and hope. But they had two small babies with them, an infant and a brand new baby just a few weeks old. And they couldn't live on rainwater and hope because they'd run out of food and water. So what did they do, the parents? They slit their own fingers and made the infants suck their blood as the only available source of nutrition. When these people were rescued, as it happens, by an American ship, they were so weak they could not stand. They had to be bodily lifted on board the ship. And when the ship came into the harbor, my staff and I broke every rule in the book to rush these people to intensive care. And then to see the same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, and embarking on new lives, that, to my mind, offered the kind of satisfaction that few jobs in the world can do. And to my mind, that's been a worthwhile motivation to have. To realize what a great privilege it is to be able to put your head to the pillow at night, knowing the things you've done during the day have made a difference to human beings' lives. Whether you do that in politics, whether you do it in UN work, whether you do it as students, as writers, as journalists, whatever you do professionally, each of us has the possibility of making a difference in the lives of other people. And that, I think, will ultimately, at the individual human level, bring us to the kind of world where the networks actually are also networks of hope and compassion, and not merely of geopolitics and ideology. Let me pull my strands together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond world leadership and global domination and all of these foreign policy concepts to cooperative relationships in a networked world. Sovereign nation states will continue proudly to guard their sovereignty, but the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transforms the very definition of the idea of sovereignty and dilutes its meanings. The ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy is to ensure the security and well-being of its own people. But the old autarkic ways of doing this will no longer work. The fact is that most of us belong to a view of the world that sees things principally in terms of our own country. I'm proud to wear an Indian flag on my lapel and have done so since before getting into politics. But at the same time, as I think about the world, I realize that, yes, we proudly and perhaps somewhat chauvinistically celebrate our Independence Day every year. But perhaps the time has come for us to realize that what we really ought to celebrate the rest of the time is something else. The recognition that every other day in our calendar in this globalized, networked world is really an interdependence day. Thank you very much for inviting me to this lecture. And despite everything I've said, Jai Hind. I'll take your questions. Now, how is this going to be done? Are you going to play traffic policewoman and choose the questioners? Shall I come and sit?
Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, I'm also from Kerala. Nice to have you here and hear your speech. I would like to know your...
Identity politics rears its head again. Go ahead.
I would like to know your opinion about the brain drain problem in India. And also many of our students are going abroad because they found that education system in our country is not sufficient and more theory oriented than skill or practical knowledge. I would like to know your opinion in this.
Okay, well, on the brain drain, I actually was never hugely convinced about that, and I'm less and less convinced today because, in fact, you're right, the brain drain did happen in the sense that a lot of qualified people with good degrees, doctors, engineers, and so on, went abroad. But they did not stay unconnected to India. Many of them have, in subsequent years, sent money, resources, technology back, have started companies here, at the very least have given significant grants, scholarships, set up institutions in this country. So one could argue that that brain drain has meant a brain gain for us, amongst other things, because they've brought in more opportunities for Indians to profit from. The question of Indian students going abroad is also beginning to change. You may well be right that a lot of students feel the need to study abroad because opportunities here aren't good enough. It may not only be because of the nature of our institutions, but that often an Indian student who can't get into an IIT may be good enough to get into a Harvard. I mean, that is a measure of the intensity of competition and the relative scarcity of places. I've always been a very staunch advocate of very liberalized expansion of educational institutions in our country. We tend, I'm afraid, in our education system, particularly in higher education, to be over-regulated and under-governed. And our system doesn't make it easy to set up institutions, to run them autonomously, and so on. So there may be a reason why people go. The only answer to that is to open up the space here, permit collaborations with foreign universities on Indian soil, allow more universities to be set up, change the regulatory system into one of accreditation instead, and essentially create templates and standards that then these institutions can aspire to. The private education space is growing, but it's also unaffordable to many. The public education space is where we need to see much more emphasis and resources, and I'm glad to say there's a lot of good, constructive new thinking going on. Not just inside government, where perhaps often it is said that government is the graveyard where good ideas go to die. There are places, for example, Azim Premji University is specializing in studying the issues of education and coming up with constructive policy suggestions. There's a lot happening out there. At the end of the day, however, what is striking is the number of students coming back. I would tell you in the 60s or 70s, pretty much every Indian student who got a scholarship and went abroad, unless they had a family business to come back to in India to run or inherit from their parents, anybody who went abroad stayed abroad. Today, that is simply not true. A lot of Indian students are coming back after their studies, and a lot are not going at all. I can tell you as minister, when I went to IIT Indore, I had the fascinating experience of seeing this amazing project. We have an astrophysics project with a gigantic telescope, which is one of only two of its kind in the world. The other one is somewhere in America. The professor running the project was a tenured professor at one of America's best universities. He came back to India to run the project at IIT Indore. And his doctoral students, including he had a bright young team leader amongst the doctoral students working with him, a young Muslim boy from a village not far from Indore, who had been offered full scholarships by the top 7 universities in America in the field, MIT, Caltech, Houston, Harvard, I've forgotten which of the ones, and he turned them all down to work with this Indian-American professor here in Indore and moving. So I think the narrative is changing, and I hope we'll be able to have more such opportunities to showcase this kind of change in future.
Dr. Tharoor.
Wherever you are?
Yeah.
Hi.
Congrats on a brilliant and engaging speech.
Thank you.
One point you said about we all have been dismissing Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilizations. But with the emergence of the Daesh again, do you think we have been too dismissive? There is some element or some grain of truth in what Huntington is saying which we are kind of trying to gloss over, especially in the context of many of the people who are joining the ISIS, they are from the West, from the Europe, I mean the people from there. Your take on this?
There is first of all, a definitional problem in identifying a civilization. So Huntington, for example, had this notion of Western, which he defined as Judeo-Christian civilization. He had Islamic civilization. But as you know, the battle that Daesh is fighting and the resistance Daesh is facing are also from fellow Muslims. Daesh is fighting against Muslim governments and Muslim rulers, whom they deem to be insufficiently Islamic, and other Muslim countries are attacking Daesh, just as some Muslim countries or Muslim benefactors once ill-advisedly financed them. So you're seeing that there is a serious division within Daesh. Even the very example you gave of Western Muslims coming to fight alongside Daesh raises serious definitional questions. What is Western civilization? If these are people who all went to Western schools, ate at McDonald's, watched Hollywood movies, drove cars, ate, wore jeans, went to Starbucks, whatever, how come Western civilization left them untouched? In which case, what is Western civilization? You remember Mahatma Gandhi was once asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he replied, I think it would be a good idea. There are these genuine challenges. So my own view is, the problem with the theory is that it's too simplistic. If you want to say that, broadly speaking, identity and particularly religious identity will be a source of division in our world, that you can say, but you can't get a whole book and a thesis and a title out of it. So I guess he went farther than he should have.
Hi, sir.
I don't mind taking as many more as you like. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also from Kerala, sir.
Right. Kerala, it's very good at getting the mic.
Yes. My question, since 91, we have had a drastic improvement in the GDP in India. But unfortunately, in the sector of HTI, we have had a poor performance. So what you think are the solutions to improve the HTA? Normally, economics says when the GDP improves, naturally the HTA also should improve. But it's not happening in India. What is the reason for that?
One simple answer, political will. Now, there is one place where I can point to Kerala with some pride, because in Kerala, the human development indicators are comparable to those of developed Western countries, because successive governments have chosen to strengthen these indicators. So you've actually had state resources being pumped into education, into hospitals, into government schools, in various institutions up and down the chain. Whereas sadly, in some Indian states, that has not happened. I thought you were going to go and say that despite GDP going up, the rich have become rich and the poor have become poorer, which is simply not accurate. There has been a gap, yes, but in fact, we've pulled about 1% roughly of our population out from below the poverty line every year. The absolute numbers of poor people in India have shrunk by about 10 million a year every year, even while the population has grown. So that has worked. But you are right that other indicators of human development have not progressed. If you start breaking India down into various states, then you'll get a clearer picture. You'll find that a state like Kerala, if it were ranked, in fact, most of the southern states, including Tamil Nadu, if they were ranked on a global index, they'd have a pretty decent rank in the top 40 or 50. But because they're part of India, and India as a whole also has UP and Bihar and Orissa and Rajasthan and so on, the HDI numbers are on the whole much lower. And what changes that is political emphasis, political will, the willingness of governments to expend resources on these things and not on other things.
Hello.
Good evening,
Mr. Tharoor.
Hi, sir.
Well, whoever has the mic.
Hello, Mr. Tharoor.
Yeah.
Here it is.
Hello.
My
Hello.
name
Sir,
is...
this is Ajay here. Excuse me?
And somebody on top of the mic. Okay.
Here I am.
Oh, here you are. All right. So after him, then we'll come up.
Okay. My name is Manish Dubey. I'm not from Kerala. I'm from UP.
Where are you from?
I'm from UP. So...
From UP. All right.
So, first of all, let me confess that I came here in Litfis just because of you, because to listen to you. And I think that is shared by most of the people here. So I'm an ardent follower of you and all your works.
Thank you.
So coming to my question, I just wanted to know your take on atheistic society in the future. You discussed in your point number 5 that the nexus between religion and politics. And in that sense, how do you think in future will the society will go in an atheistic way of life, or let's isolate ISIS or Daesh in this context, and let's discuss only on the globalization and the role of internet in making the enlightened mind. And I'm atheist. Let's discuss not discuss on that. But still, will it go into an atheistic society? The concise.
No, I think the trend is in the opposite direction. What I'm seeing is that the thrust for secularization, agnosticism, atheism was actually stronger in the middle of the 20th century, when there was also a great deal of disillusionment because of the wars and destruction of the first half of the 20th century. A lot more people were prepared to turn away from religion. Whereas today the trend is much more towards religion. And not just any one religion, but multiple religions, including, frankly, what we're seeing in India with the use of the politics of religious mobilization coming into play, and people openly pursuing religious polarization before elections and so on. So I think rather than heading towards atheism, we're heading towards more use of religion and more consciousness of religion as an embodiment of identity. Sorry, what was that warning you were flashing? How many minutes left?
Hello? Hello?
Somebody on top, yes.
Sir, actually, India need not have internet knowledge 80%, 90%. We don't need so much knowledge like America or something. We need only 30%, 40%. Who will grow food? What about the agriculture? What about the cotton? What about the fisheries? So we don't need everybody to learn internet, and that's not a knowledge. Internet is just giving informations.
Why can't a farmer or a fisherman find useful information on the internet? Today in Kerala...
What do you do with the information? If there is nobody to grow,
today
what
in
do you
Kerala,
do with the information?
Today in Kerala, you can get an app that the state government gives you that will identify on your phone with GPS and on the internet where the best shoals of fish are for you to catch. And you can go out and catch that fish. You can come back towards the coast, and you can start on your mobile phone, once you get within range, dialing all the market towns along the coast to see where you can fetch the best price for the fish you've caught. Now, these are transformative technologies. Even a simple piece of information, such as in the old days, what would a farmer do? You asked about a farmer. A farmer, once he has harvested his crop, either he or an able-bodied male relative, sometimes a 10-year-old boy, will have to walk 8, 10, 12 kilometers in the hot sun to the nearest market town, find out if the market was open, find out if the crop he's harvested could be sold that day, find out what price it would fetch, what the competition was. Then the poor kid will walk back 8, 10, 12 kilometers to the farm. They will load the cart. They will head off. Half a day's back-breaking work that can now be solved with 2 clicks of a mouse. So why would you say the internet doesn't help farmers and fishermen? Of course it can.
I'm sorry, I hate to do this. We've really run out of time.
Yeah.
You answered his question.
I think I've answered that, so thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll have your last question.
This is the last question.
May I?
We never had a lady, I think.
No reservations, please.
Or you and the lady, then we'll stop.
Good evening, Mr. Tharoor. I heard you speak and you were guiding all the youngsters. I just wanted to know, in the network world, being a part of the parliament, what are you, because the image that people abroad make of India is a country full of blue tape and corruption. What are you as a part of parliament, and what is your group of parliamentarians trying to change that perspective now that everybody is watching you keenly and parliament hardly makes business? I mean, it gives us all pain. And how's your group of parliamentarians, or how is the group of parliamentarians trying to transform? Because you are the front face of the country, aren't you?
Right. Well, you've raised a number of issues. There are two different ones that need to be addressed. One is on Parliament's functioning or not functioning, disruption, and so on. As some of you know, I've deplored the practice of parliamentary disruption at a time when the very people who are now in power were justifying it, since they were in opposition. And sadly, what I've discovered is that the golden rule of our politics, you know, all of you have been to missionary schools, I hope, and studied the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, the golden rule in politics is do unto others what they have done unto you. So there is now a situation where, sadly, the example set by the BJP over the last 10 years when they were in opposition and disrupted the House is the example that many in the opposition today are choosing to follow. And I really do think that some sort of peace conference will have to be convened and a reasonable solution found, because this is not a good use of Parliament as an institution and of the taxpayers' legitimate expectations of the institution. As someone who does his homework every day, goes prepared to ask questions, make speeches, intervene in debates, I'm enormously frustrated by the disruption, as must be my fellow parliamentarians for the most part. But at the same time, it was not my generation of politicians that made disruption into a quote-unquote legitimate parliamentary tactic. And some of those who justified it in the past are the ones now bearing the brunt of it by sitting in government and facing it. On the question of corruption, yes, we'll come to the lady or the child, young man, okay. It's a wrap, yes. Yeah. The previous one, as you know, ran late. That's why we began late. I just wanted to do justice to his question, which is that corruption is very sadly deeply endemic in our society. When I went abroad in 1975 to study, I could truly say that up to that point, nobody in my family had ever had to pay a bribe for anything. As I kept coming back on vacations, I found that changing systematically to a point where today, practically every one of us is to some degree or the other complicit in the act of corruption. It's entrenched across our society. People do it very often because they feel they have no choice. I've often pointed out that if you look at corruption only in terms of the big ticket headlines in the newspapers, the 1,76,000 crores that CAG identified in telecoms and so on, you're actually missing out the daily experience of corruption for most common people in our country. It's the pregnant working class woman who is entitled by law to deliver her baby in a government hospital, but will have to do so on the floor unless she can bribe an orderly to get a bed. Or the person who loses a father or a mother and will not get the death certificate in time unless they're able to bribe the municipal clerk. Or the widow who can't get her husband's pension papers processed without paying a bribe. And these are the kinds of examples that represent daily experience of corruption for ordinary people in our country. And frankly, that has to stop. I only wish that Anna Hazare had in his movement, which ended up being a somewhat futile one, if he had instead used the opportunity to get every person in every one of his rallies to simply take a solemn oath before God or their ancestors or their father's ashes or whatever it was they wanted, that they would never ever give a bribe to anybody for any reason, even if it meant having to wait long, even if it meant, if they had done that, perhaps it could have changed, because every corrupt transaction requires both a giver and a taker. If no one would give, how could anyone take? But the point is, we all give. We all give because the Indian attitude is, if we don't give, the other chap will give, my rival will give, my business competitor will give, so I better give. And I speak to businessmen all the time who tell me, oh, we just take it as part of the normal costs of doing business. Well, that's wrong. And if we keep defining our standards down to that level, we ourselves as a society become deeply complicit. And I'm not exempting politics, I'm not exempting any field, it's widespread. But let's face it, every time you point one finger at the corrupt, there are three fingers pointing back at you. That little child, I think, yeah. Oh, he had the mic, didn't he? Oh, don't pull it away from a little boy, that's terrible, come on. Yeah, it's come.
Thank you for the
How old are you?
11.
11, right. Let's hear an 11-year-old's question. The future speaks.
Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering whether globalization and sort of world harmony would ever become a reality with all these groups, religious groups forming everywhere. You can see it everywhere. Like, a few days ago, Donald Trump, and over here, RSS.
Don't let the dawn trump this debate. Look, I mean, I don't know. I smashed my crystal ball on the way over, so I can't predict the future. But I will say that what's interesting is that both forces exist at the same time. The forces that are pulling us together, the forces that are pushing us apart. Ultimately, your generation is going to have to make some of these choices. You're going to have to work towards a different sort of world. I think if we can promote, as I said in my speech, a way in which we can respect people's differences, accept that each of us has these differences, but accept too that we are entitled to have those differences. And if we can create a culture and an attitude, both in our own country and in our relations with others, that promotes that, maybe we will have countries eventually learning to live with each other. Look, nothing is irreversible in history. For 1,000 years, for example, the British and the French were at each other's throats. They were each other's bitterest enemies. Today, it's almost inconceivable. You can't think of the British and the French going to war with each other. Or the French and the Germans, same story. They've become such close friends today. So everything can be changed. We can, I believe, hope for peace, hope for understanding, have a more united, globalized world, and your generation will have to work for it. Thank you.
So nice to end on this optimistic note. Thanks.